Wow, wow, wow. Another wonderful day in the world of science. I love it when you can open up a journal or link to a new paper, which is brand new research being revealed to the world, which tells you something new about this world that you didn't know about. Today, we learn there were mastodons in Greenland, among many other things, in a brand new publication out in the journal Nature. We're just going to take a look at one small portion of that because now let me preface that just to let you know what you're getting into. I've been asked many times, Joel, what is it about this world that makes you skeptical, like in the physical world, makes you skeptical of this young Earth creationist paradigm, that the world is actually young and not millions or billions of years old? And one of my go-to answers has involved elephants. And I've written about that many times on my blog and so forth. And so now I pick up this paper and it's talking about mastodons in Greenland. And as I read through it, I was like, case in point, here's another example of new data revealed to us in which you're faced with the prospect of having to place it within some kind of paradigm, right? How do these mastodons fit into the history of the world? I'm going to tell you, it's really hard to fit these mastodons into a young Earth paradigm or young Earth worldview, whereas it's relatively easy to understand how they would fit into a world that's hundreds of thousands and millions of years old. So mastodons in Greenland, how do we know? And why does it matter? Let's get into that coming up. Hey, welcome back. I really don't have time to do this. I shouldn't be doing it. I've got a lot of grading to do. There's a bunch of things that need my attention. I've got this master's thesis right here that I need to read before tomorrow for a defense on cultured cave bacteria. But this was too good to pass up. I just couldn't help myself. I was so excited by this particular article. This was just published this afternoon. A 2.1-year-old ecosystem in Greenland uncovered by environmental DNA, published in the journal Nature. You can see a whole bunch of authors. The primary author, Kurt, I don't know how to say his name, Kajier, from Denmark, have gone to the northern reaches of Greenland, the very tippy top of Greenland, 600 miles from the North Pole, and extracted DNA from the dirt. And that DNA tells them there once were mastodons roaming around at the very tip of Greenland. Not only mastodons, but reindeer, snowshoe hares, several other different animals, and then lots and lots of different plants. Right? So this is an environmental DNA study. Environmental DNA is where you extract DNA straight from the environment. And you can do that in a recent environment. In this case, they're looking at a very, very old environment, an environment that's been encased in permafrost for, as they report, for what they think is 2 million years. And so they have reconstructed a 2-million-year-old ecosystem by simply examining little pieces of DNA that are still remaining in that permafrost, and then identifying what organisms those DNA belonged to or did belong to at the time. And therefore giving them a picture of all the different organisms that were living at one slice in time. Actually, they looked at about 40 different slices in time because they have 40-some samples in different locations at different in different strata. And so those would be different ecosystems that have lived over different times in this region. Let's talk a little bit about the site before we start delving into the significance of the results. Let me pull out my pen here. All right, so here we have North Pole, all right, in this area. And this is where they collected these samples, right at the very top of Greenland, about 600 miles away from the North Pole. And looking a little closer, all these different numbers represent sample sites. And so they've sampled a whole bunch of different locations, and this is all permafrost or soil that has ice is encased, or there's ice in the soil, and they've grabbed samples, so they've been presumably cold for a very long period of time. And this ranges over 80 some meters. So well over a couple 100 feet, all right, of elevation up the sides of hills. And so this shows you that they have a couple different locations of samples that they extracted DNA from. And then in total, they kind of give this particular paper kind of gives a composite image of all the different types of organisms they recognize by doing an analysis of those DNA fragments. All right, again, I want to emphasize the extreme nature of this particular site. So right in here is where they're collecting those samples. And so just think about this location, and then we're going to talk about the types of organisms that were there. And again, it's just right in here. All right, so this is a very remote field location, only accessible for a very short period of time each year. And you're a whole long way from home when you're sampling at a location like this. All right, so here's an example of somebody has scraped away the topsoil or the surface sediments on the side of this hill to get down to sort of the permafrost layer. And then he's drilling into the side of this hill where he sees sort of these bands of organic matter. All right, so there's all these different layers in the side of the hill. And then they're pulling out these little plugs. And then they go out, they save the plugs. They're taking them back to a lab. And then they're going to thaw those plugs out. And then at the same time, they're going to extract all the DNA found in those plugs. Now, some of that DNA might actually be in microorganisms, so actually in cells still that are preserved. But in many cases, it's just naked pieces of DNA that are in the environment. Just like there's probably some DNA on my desk here. And if I took a little wipe, of the desk, there would be some just DNA that's starting to break down the surface where my cells have fallen apart, right? And so there's DNA in the environment. I've done this kind of analysis for a number of different things, most recently for water samples from the Arctic, in which they just extract water from extract DNA straight from the water column, and then extract DNA from the organisms that sediment out. So if you centrifuge a liter of water taken from a different depth in the Arctic Ocean, and you centrifuge that, you'll get a whole bunch of cells or a bunch of debris. And from that, I can take a sample and then extract the DNA from that. But then I also take an actual sample of the water and extract DNA straight out of the water. And those would be organisms that have lysed in the water column, and now their naked DNA strands are actually still floating in the water for prolonged periods of time. Right. So in this case, you have DNA in the permafrost. And the big question, of course, has been how long can DNA be preserved? And this is a record holder now, all right? 2.1 or about 2 million years is the age that was determined by a number of different, in a number of different ways, this particular site. And as it turns out, it's actually, I don't even know where to begin here because there's just so much stuff in this paper, and I don't want to go over it all. I just want to get to one major type thing. I want to talk about the mastodon. So let's get there, but I just want to give you a sense for some of the things that are going on. How much sequence did they extract, right, from these samples? Using a number of different sequencing methods, they got a total of 16 billion, right? 882 million different reads. So 16 billion little fragments of DNA were sequenced. And then after trimming, filtering for greater than 30 base pairs, so they're looking for fragments that are more than 30 base pairs, which tells you a lot of those fragments were less than 30 base pairs. And some minimal quality of the sequences themselves, and some duplicates that occur in part of the process. They ended up with 2.8 billion reads. Now that's 2.8 billion reads that are 30 base pairs or more, so that's 2.8 times 30. So that's 70 billion base pairs of DNA sequence that they were able to obtain from these, just thawing out some soil from this northern point of Greenland. Now, what you do with those sequences then is you take those short fragments. In some cases, what you do is you concatenate them, or you look for overlapping fragments of the same sequence of, say, 20 base pairs or 30 base pairs. And then you can build out from there, and you can construct something like mitochondrial genomes or chloroplast genomes for plants, or at least large segments of various genomes that are represented in all those different fragments. In some cases, you're just looking at maybe a 50 base pair fragment that's part of a specific gene. And they actually did target particular genes that are conserved genes that they could use to compare to known sequences of known living organisms to see how similar they are to these past organisms. All right, so you take all those sequences and then you blast them or compare them to these databases that they constructed of other common Arctic organisms. This is plants and marine biota and animal, all right, biota, or land animal biota. And then you get various hits for, sequence similarity. So this has a mitochondrial genome that is within 95% similar to a sequence of a known organism that's alive today. Now, first of all, you should know that they didn't find anything in this sequence that was identical to living organisms today and living genomes today. That's one indication that these sequences actually come from long extinct organisms or long since dead organisms, right? Not recent samples. This isn't a contamination. These are really old organisms because they find very similar sequences to modern organisms, but they're not the same as any that are alive today. So representing some kind of change over time. So what did they find? And again, just going to hit the highlights here. I'm sure that I will probably do some other videos in which we maybe go a little more in depth in this because I love the ancient DNA stuff and I've talked about it before here on this channel. This is just giving you a quick overview. This is, I think, figure 2, maybe 2 or 3 in the paper. And what we have here is all of these down here represent different samples, right? So they extract DNA from these different samples, get sequences from those, and then find out what kind of DNA sequences represent different genomes, all right, that are in that particular sample that we found in that sediment. And you can see here that there is a particular bird. Actually, it's a kind of goose related to Canadian geese. And that was found in multiple different samples. You've got reindeer found in multiple different locations. And the really important one here is Mastodon sequences were found in multiple different samples at multiple sites that were thousands of feet away from each other. I think actually quite a bit farther than that. And so this is evidence that mastodons were present not only across a wide area, but also probably over a long period of time because these are at different elevations, these samples. And you can see there's a lot of rabbit sequence. How dark the red is represents the number of reeds that were in the sequence, right? They had billions of reeds, right? And so how many fragments were rabbit fragments, right, in this particular sample? So if you had a sample and you got, a billion reeds, or let's say 500,000 reeds from one particular sample, how many of those are rabbits compared to other things? All right. Oh, they found a couple ants all the way up there. All right. Fleas. And I'm not going to show you the plants, but they found 100 different types of plants growing in the area, which are all typical of sort of northern boreal climates in, say, middle of Canada. But remember, we're a whole lot farther north than that, in northern Greenland. All right, let's get to the big picture here. Let's get to the elephants. All right, or the elephant family. And so you have your modern elephants right here, or I'll say your living elephants, your extant elephants. You have your mammoths, which are all extinct. And if you do a little phylogeny using DNA sequences, and we do have lots of DNA sequences from mammoths, not 2 million year old sequences. We have 50,000 or 100,000 year old sequences. And we have almost a complete genome sequence of the mastodon as well. All right. But again, it's not nearly as old. And this little dot right here, which they did for a whole bunch of different phylogenies of other organisms, is where sort of this particular sequence lies. In other words, it lies at the root of mastodons, and it has differences between all the other sequences that are known of mastodons that are much younger. And so it's showing that it looks like kind of like an ancestral sequence to the more, I'll call them modern mastodons. And this is what they found for other groups too, like reindeer and the hares and a bunch of different plants and so forth, is they found, like, for example, in the reindeer, maybe I'm getting ahead of myself because I had that. Here we go. All right, you had the reindeer, and this is the reindeer down here. And so here you have a whole bunch of sequences showing the diversity of reindeers from various locations of the world, living reindeer. And so in a phylogeny, this basal node right here represents the origin, or if you were to, you could trace back all these living reindeer, all the diversity of living reindeer to some common ancestor, right, that lived sometime in the past. And that past could be, different estimates, but that past could be tens of thousands of years ago or 100,000 years ago, most likely, in the thousands to 10,000s of years. All the living reindeer today probably trace their origins back to individuals back then. Well, where they're putting this dot right here is like, this is how different this sequence is of a reindeer. This sequence is most similar to reindeer, but it has differences to all modern reindeer. And so they're saying it falls farther below the root. In other words, it's not just, it's not like similar to some other reindeer that's alive today. All right. Like reindeer that live in Finland versus reindeer that live in some other part of the world. All right. No, they're different than all living reindeer, all living diversity of reindeer. And so that's interesting because it's actually consistent with this particular sample they extracted from the soil being very, very old and representing reindeer that lived, maybe a reindeer that's a very similar species, if not, could be the same species, but could also be a slightly different species. But living a couple million years ago, and you would expect, in fact, you should absolutely expect it to be different because it will have accumulated mutations over time to get to the present day reindeer. And so this was a consistent pattern that they found looking at a variety of different organisms, that they're always finding sort of a basal version to the modern groups of those same animals in the 2 million year old sample. So that's a nice confirmation that these sequences are in fact of very, very old individuals that lived long ago versus much more recently. All right, now, this is fantastic confirmation that mastodons lived in Greenland. And I'm not sure from the paper, but I kind of gather that I don't think there was any evidence that mastodons had ever lived in Greenland before. It's not like a whole lot of Greenland has been investigated, and most of it's covered with ice, and so there's a very poor fossil record. And so here we have, here's a very large island, and you've got mastodons living there. And not just like maybe passing by, but it appears they lived in an ecosystem that would have supported them. And they were found at multiple different locations. So again, I want to show you, like here, this person is digging out through the soft surface layer, which has probably experienced some freezing and thawing, and they want to get away from that because any kind of thawing is going to more rapidly decay the DNA. So they're digging down to this permanently frozen portion of the hillside that hopefully represents something that's been permanently frozen for potentially 2 million years, and extract that DNA from there. But here's what I want you to key in on. Notice where he's digging. There's a hill that goes way up here, right? Oh, I'm probably pointing underneath my own head here. There's a hill that goes way up there. All right, so if there is layers of sediment right here that contain mastodon DNA and layers of sediment that contain a whole bunch of different plants, and that is what this layer represents, or you can see these layers right here. These layers represent thick pads of, a lot of organic material, as if it represents like a meadow. All right, a meadow with a whole bunch of different plants and probably some algae and some mosses, and then you have various boreal trees growing in there. and then these other different animals that live around and walk through this meadow and tromp through this meadow. And so if this represents a meadow, and then there's some sediments on top of that are just mostly inorganic material, and then there's another meadow, and then there's more inorganic material, and then there's another layer of organic material. This represents a meadow or marshland that then was maybe flooded, and then soil was brought in on top of that, and then another marshland developed, and then so forth, all right? So these represent distinct periods of time, all right, separated by maybe flooding events, or maybe potentially even hundreds of years of just a different climate that was less conducive to having a meadow in this particular location. And they're just digging into one of these and extracting the DNA from it. Let's look at this a little further. Here are located, so some of their collection sites, and they're actually circling somebody up here on the top of this hill to give you a little bit of an idea of the size of this hill. So here's somebody up here who's extracting DNA from some layer of organic material that's in the side of this hill. But you can see all these different layers here. And this has a relief of about a little over a couple, maybe 150 feet here, from what I remember. And again, a bunch of different layers. And over here, you can see all these different layers. So what are all these layers? These layers would have been at one time, even though you can see the side of them now, this whole area was all higher up and it's been eroded. And originally it was lower, and then it was filled like a shallow valley, and gradually layers are building on top of each other, probably from mountains off in the farther distance that are running through there. There's a stream running through this area, and it's constantly adding more sediment to this area, and then one meadow after another, all right? One sort of actually probably more like boggy area is developing on top of each other, and they're piling up over time until you have hundreds of feet thick worth of these different ecosystems that have been preserved. And then later, right, you have another ice age. This whole thing gets covered up with ice and a whole lot more sediment from erosion from the higher mountains that are a little bit farther away. All right, and then since the latest, all right, the most recent ice age, all of this has been eroding more and then exposing what had once been these very lush lands. And so there's a massive amount of organic material actually contained inside of these hills, representing a time which clearly this wasn't nearly as cold as it is today. This is a very forbidding place. There's not much alive, as you can see in these pictures. There's not a whole lot going on here, in terms of life. That's because it's really cold right now. But it's very obvious that at one time the environment was much warmer. All right, that brings us to the conundrum. All right, this isn't a conundrum for those who believe the world is ancient and has undergone a number of different climatic shifts over time, in which case the ecosystems of the world have changed and shifted around. Organisms have slowly moved and adapted to different environments. All right, as I say, at different times in the past, in this case 2 million years ago, there's a lot of evidence from other locations in the world that have been dated to that age that was a much, much warmer time. 15 to 17 degrees Celsius, so some 20 some degrees Fahrenheit on average warmer than it is today. So a very warm climate. And at that time, most of Greenland would have been, maybe only some ice in the center. And this would have been all habitable around the edges. And you would have had these forests growing there and had a bunch of different animals growing there. It's a very lush environment, lots of vegetation. So how did the Mastodons get there? So Mastodons, there is some land close to Greenland, but Greenland is a separate island. And members of the elephant family can swim quite far, so it's quite possible that they could swim across, especially when it was a little bit warmer. But you have to remember also, when the world was warmer and there wasn't nearly as much ice, all right, the ocean levels were higher as well, in which case the amount of water between these two sets of land was greater. All right, where am I going with all this? All right, I'm kind of building up to this. How would a young Earth creationist explain the presence of mastodons living in an ecosystem that looks like it's been multiple different ecosystems on top of one another, pancaked layers of ecosystems, representing themselves tens, if not hundreds of thousands of years. All right, but let's say tens of thousands of years. Where do they fit it in? Where does a young Earth creationist fit this in? So you have Noah's flood 4,500 years ago. Cover the world is the thing that dramatically changed the entire landscape. Off of the ark, which animals are departing the ark over here, some kind of elephant departs the ark. Just 2 elephants. Now those 2 elephants have to diverge as they begin to populate the world into about 100 different species of elephant types, of which only a few of them exist today. Right, because all the different types of elephants exist in this post-flood world, according to most young Earth creationists. But let's just concern ourselves with the mastodons. The mastodons, right, elephants are migrating, and then you got lots and lots and lots of mammoths eventually that live in this area. But eventually you have to have these other variants of an elephant, and mastodons really are very different. All right, they're in their own genus, separate genus versus the other elephants. For a number of reasons. So the mastodons, which are very different, they managed to migrate. Presumably, they're able to migrate across the Bering Strait, get into North America, and then from North America, they'd have to work their way up and across a number of different islands, and then get to Greenland, and then make their way all the way up here and make a home up there. They have to have gotten there. In less than 200 years after they departed from the ark. So in less than 200 years, elephants had to make it all the way here. Now remember, there's only 2 to start out with, we don't have time to go over their gestational period and all that. Let's just say it takes a while to make a lot of elephants. Right? It takes a while to have offspring and then have more offspring. And yes, they can grow and divide, but there's millions upon millions, tens of millions of mammoths that all had to have lived and died, all right, before or around the Ice Age. And where's the biblical Ice Age? Remember, you've got Noah's flood is 4,500. I don't think I'm going to be able to do this. 4,500 years. Yeah, I can't do this. 4,500 years. When's the biblical Ice Age? Because young Earth creationists do believe there was an Ice Age. They can't deny the evidence that the world was covered with ice, or a large portion of it was. And they say that had to have happened after Noah's flood. And so they say that happened somewhere like 4,200, let's say 4,250, like 4,100 to 4,350 years. All right, just a couple hundred years after the flood. Now, I just showed you that the locations where these mammoths are found, or mastodons are found, are in layers of sediment that had to be laid down in some kind of valley, built up over time. And so their DNA is trapped in these different layers, along with reindeer, along with a bunch of other different organisms. They all had to get there collectively as a community. And these animals are really well adapted for being this far north. That's another amazing thing. Like, how do they adapt that fast in just a couple generations? Because for elephants to get there in just a couple hundred years, they're only a few generations removed from the elephants that were on the ark. And yet here they are living in this super northern climate. And mastodons didn't necessarily have the same kind of, they're not woolly mammoths, right? This is a much warmer environment. And why do I say they have to have gotten there before the biblical Ice Age? Because that's the only time that they could have lived there. Because that's the only time the world was warm, according to young Earth creationists. They would say, like, after the flood, there's so much heat that was generated by plate tectonics and all this stuff that the world's oceans and the environment was much, much warmer. All right, so they can kind of try to explain why there is a much warmer climate in northern Greenland at that time. And so it could support all these different types of organisms. But the organisms have to get there. But to get there, at that time, the world also had to have been covered with a lot more water because none of this ice existed. All right. And so there's a huge gulf. This really is an island. So how did these mastodons get onto that island in time? They had to get there. They had to thrive there in some sense, right? Along with all these other organisms. And then they had to be pushed to extinction and pushed out by this ice age only over a period of a couple hundred years. And yet I just have to go back and say, like, you know, if there's mastodons that were buried in layers of sediment that are way down here, where did all these other layers come from during that time? And why are there different layers of organic material that seem to represent, complex ecosystems in there? This isn't This isn't a random jumble of stuff. This can't be looked at and said, well, that's the flood. The flood did that, right? All right. The flood trapped those that DNA of those different organisms there. How did the flood trap DNA of a bunch of Arctic adapted organisms in sediments at this particular location, especially of organisms that most young Earth creationists believe didn't even adapt to the Arctic until after Noah's flood? So they all had to get there somehow. It's really stretching it to say that elephants on the Ark just made a beeline for northern Greenland and managed to get themselves there in 50 years or 100 years. It just is. And so what we have here is, and this is an illustration by Beth Zakin of what potentially northern Greenland looked like at this time. And so, again, this type of environment doesn't just develop overnight. By the way, all the plants and all the animals pictured in this image are ones for which there is DNA evidence that they existed within this small area. And so this is an ecosystem that seems to be a functional unit. And that usually requires a large amount of time for the organisms to adapt to each other, to adapt to this particular environment. You have trees there that themselves would be decades old, if not 100 years old themselves. And then you have multiple layers of these types of environments on top of each other. And you don't have a global flood around to explain how you get these layers pancaked on top of one another. This is just, in my mind, really mind-blowing to think about within a young Earth creationist perspective. Now, Ken Ham likes to say, and he says it all the time at his talks, that if you just opened your eyes and you just looked at the evidence, the evidence is all around us for a young Earth. Like, it's just obvious. Like, you just look at these things, it's like, oh, yeah, see, I could explain that by a young Earth. These are the types of brand new pieces of evidence that come to light that a student at a university or a biologist or a geologist is going to be looking at. And if what they've learned is young Earth creationism, I've just touched the tip of the iceberg in terms of how difficult it is to sort of manipulate this kind of data into that particular world. You could you could say, well, okay, some of those birds were able to fly there. Rabbits can, they breed really fast and they could get there. But it's the adaptations to these particular places. It's the development of the ecosystem over time. You don't just have barren land after a global flood, and then you just have, boom, all of a sudden you have a well-developed ecosystem like this. I should go back and say that in the paper, they have actual physical evidence of the same organisms, a lot of the same organisms, except the mastodons, living there at that time. So they've extracted seeds and pollen grains from this organic mass, and they found that they can identify a variety of different grasses, they can identify a bunch of these different aquatic plants, they can identify the different types of trees and the different kinds of shrubs that are there, and that's been cataloged, right, in other both their research, this current research, and in past research, they already had an idea of like, here's the type of organisms that are here. What's really remarkable about this study is that by just going in and just extracting DNA itself from the soil, from this frozen soil, and then just getting little pieces of sequence and then saying like, what is this piece of sequence, right? Oh, it's most similar to X organism. And that organism is, oh, well, that's a very similar to a sequence of a living species that lives in a similar environment today. And actually looks a lot like the types of species that they have found the physical evidence for in those particular locations. So again, can't be explained by just, hey, this is just DNA that was in the flood and then it just ended up right at this location. No, the actual physical organisms are there themselves too. As I said in my intro, I mean, really every day I probably open up an article, I look at it, and I say, this can easily be explained. I mean, the particular combination of organisms that are here, the fact that these organisms are living about 1,000 miles north of where any of these organisms can survive today, the presence of mastodons on this huge island. All of these things are relatively easy to explain if you have an Earth which has undergone a number of different climatic shifts and changes over time. So, for example, the mastodons. Well, how did they get there? I kind of made it sound like, well, how did the mastodons get there for young Earth creationists? They had to like swim across this, large amount of water in order to get to this particular island. No, mastodons and mammoths could get to Greenland during some of the times when it was colder. I mean, surely there were years in which you had frozen water across these waterways. They could migrate across during a colder time and then moved into southern Greenland. And then as it warmed up, the environment warmed up to the point where it's 2 million years ago and we're looking at it today and most of the ice is melted, they could just migrate north as they migrate along with these communities. All right, ecosystems move when the climate changes, and we have plenty of evidence for that down in Tennessee, in the Appalachian Mountains, the upper mountains were a lot colder in the past, and they had boreal forests, just like middle of Canada does today. But now they're basically pushed off the top of the mountains because of the warmer temperatures, and the boreal forest is moving north as the climate warms. And so just like that, in Greenland, you can also have this shift where you have the southern Greenland plants and animals basically move all the way north to the very tip of it when it's very warm. And then, of course, it got very, very cold. And now only, some of these organisms or relatives of these organisms still live in southern Greenland today. But none of them live in this incredibly barren landscape of northern Greenland. And for the young Earth creationist, there's no way to squeeze these organisms and all of these different fossils and the ancient DNA into the post-Ice Age time. Because ever since the Ice Age, the world has been warming up in their minds. And so it's been nothing but colder since the Ice Age. And so that area has been inhabitable, all right, since the biblical Ice Age 4,200 years ago. And in the secular time scale, this would be, like since the last 20,000 years, since the last Ice Age, it's gradually become a little more accessible than it was then, but it's still permafrost. Now, what about before that? I mean, in the secular timeline, of course, the conventional timeline, there's been many Ice Ages, right, spanning millions of years. This 2 million year time period is just a time period in which the world was much warmer between other ice ages. So there would have been an ice age earlier, in which case animals and plants are displaced farther south. And then as they come up north or displaced towards southern Greenland, and then as it warms up, like I just said, you'd have these communities moving north. And there's also evidence over there in Canada too, in inhabitable areas of Canada today, that was also a lush green area as well. And young Earth creationists have to place that green time, okay, when Greenland was really green. They have to place it in this really short time frame of Noah's Ark to the beginning of the Ice Age when everything would have been shoved out. So you've got like just a couple hundred years. A couple hundred years to grow forest, to grow marshes, to grow wetlands, to grow and develop bogs, all right? To have large numbers of animals, to have the types of interactions of those animals that are balanced. And what I mean by balance is that natural selection has sculpted those environments such that they have the correct sort of numbers of those organisms to enable those types of communities to persist as they are. Younger races just don't have enough time for the existence of these things, and all the animals had to migrate there. And they have, that's a migration problem. That is a serious migration problem, getting these animals there. You can ad hoc your way to explaining, like, you come up with some crazy hypothesis for how one particular individual there or how one particular type of organism might have gotten there. But you have to get all these types of organisms there. And these are like the same kind of group of organisms you find here as the same kind of typical type of group of organisms you would find, types of organisms you find in northern Canada or in northern Europe or northern Asia. Different species, though, in those different places. All right, so yeah, elephants are a real challenge. And one of the challenges, and I've written with a colleague of mine about the population problem. We've actually done a educational paper on understanding population growth using elephants and trying to understand population growth curves along with carrying capacity. And creationists tend to look at it and say, well, if two elephants had 4 babies over a certain amount of time, and each one of them grew up and they had babies and so forth, it goes exponential, and you could explain how there could be millions of elephants over time. But they have to get the millions of elephants in within the first couple hundred years. They don't have 4,000 years to fit all the elephants in. And there's 100 other species of elephants. And they all have to be descendants of the same elephants on the ark. And so all of them have to be part of the population. And my colleague and I, in unpublished data, have done a lot of work to try to calculate what the total number of elephants that may have existed on Earth over time. All right. And of course, we're calculating over millions of years. But we also have an extrapolation from the known fossils, because there are some species that are known from a lot of fossils. And then if you think about how many organisms you don't see because you only capture a small fragment of the total population in the fossil record, you can do some very, conservative estimates of total population size of the elephants. So even if you assumed all elephants were alive at the same time and not spread out over millions of years, you will end up with a calculation of absolutely enormous numbers of elephants that had all been alive within a 100 to 200 year time period. To the point where essentially you have I can't remember now. It was like 1 to 3 elephants per every square mile on the face of the earth. That would certainly be noticeable, if there were that many elephants alive all at one time. And that's the kind of thing you need in order to explain, say, the millions of tusks that are clearly found in the permafrost just in Siberia. Much less the ones that are also found in North America and so forth. So the elephant population growth problem is, in my mind, one of the simplest mathematical methods of showing why the dispersal and growth of all of the organisms that are descendants of the ark kinds or the ark animals just doesn't work. And elephants are one of the best places to see that. And then it's not just finding the numbers, it's also explaining the distribution of those elephants in different parts of the world. Because South America has their own elephant species. And I'm talking about elephants in the large sense, not like the genus elephants, but the elephant family, I guess you'd say. And there's just a wide variety, a diversity of elephants in terms of their morphologies and shapes and the different kinds of habitats that they lived in. And then you have the additional problem of Sorry, I'm rambling on about elephants, but I'm just thinking about all the things I've thought about with elephants before. But you also have the intriguing thing that I think a lot of creationists don't deal with very often, which is how do you explain when you have multiple different species of the same kind living in the same area, and yet they're very different, right? So like multiple different species of horses that inhabit the same general area, they are focused on different kinds of foods, say. And elephants, same way. You got mammoths and you have mastodons, and they actually do eat different kinds of food because they have very different types of teeth. How does that diversity arise? What is the mechanism for young Earth creationists that would allow for that kind of diversity to develop when species are almost living side by side? That's another intriguing question. But I digress. Yes, so back to the paper. This paper is notable because, for one thing, it's suggesting that DNA can survive for 2 million years. The previous upper limit for finding a reasonable amount of DNA in samples, there's been some scant little pieces of DNA that have been older than 1 million years, but 1 million years is usually been considered sort of like, at 1 million years, you're really pushing it. And it has to be under very special conditions in order to have preservation happen. And it's always been known that permafrost is probably one of the better conditions for preserving DNA. And I can't go through all their talk about why they think this DNA is preserved better. Maybe we can hit that at another time. But they have found in their samples over 2 billion fragments of DNA that are more than 30 base pairs long. That's really significant. And the patterns of, there is degradation in that DNA. So DNA is subject to a number of different chemical modifications over time. And so after DNA is no longer being supported by a cell, a number of different chemical modifications can happen. And certain bases, you got your A's, your C's, your T's, your G's, are affected differently by those modifications. And so they're very cognizant of that. They looked at their strings of DNA, and they were able to identify that the ones that are the types of bases that are predicted to be more likely to be miscalled because of chemical modification are exactly the ones that they see changed in their particular sequences. And the real beauty of it is that the older the ancient DNA is, the more modification there is of these particular bases, such that you get a larger and larger and larger ratio of incorrect calls for certain bases versus the other ones, which are more stable. And so if you have very young DNA, recently, DNA that was recently in a living thing, you shouldn't have really any difference between the two types of bases and their degradation, all right, or chemical modification. But then as the DNA sits in a substrate, some of those, there's an imbalance in the amount of chemical modification that occurs, and it adds up over time. All right, and this has been known from looking at lots of different ancient DNA samples of different ages, anywhere from hundreds of years to thousands of years to 10,000s of years to hundreds of thousands of years. You can see a very distinct pattern of DNA degradation. And what they found in their samples was the most extreme ratio of differences between samples. And what they do is when they're comparing their DNA sequences past to present, they're careful to exclude the bases that are known to be potentially modified such that it fools you into thinking it's a base that it isn't. And so they're using the transversions, a specific type of mutation, in order to do their comparisons. All right? But the notable thing there is the prediction of just how much this ratio should get skewed between the good bases and the bad bases is pretty much what they see, given that the bases are potentially 2 million years old, right? That they've been held on for 2 million years. So that's pretty cool. And they still find fragments that are well over 30 base pairs long. As long as DNA can be found that's maybe 15 base pairs or longer, we'll be able to construct significant amounts of DNA from genomes from past organisms. And so they hint that they think potentially under the same kind of conditions, if they found permafrost samples from 5 million years ago, they imagine that you might be able to get DNA from up to that old, which would really be remarkable. And I'm pretty hopeful that that will happen. In fact, I feel pretty confident that that will happen someday. All right, so they're going to find out, they're going to learn a lot about, again, exploring how DNA is preserved, and that might also help us find other environments where similar effects are going on, because it has to do with the types of minerals that are in the soils as well. It's not just being in ice. It's the type of things that DNA is bound to, because this DNA is clearly bound to other molecules by various charges and so forth, which are probably, I just said I wasn't going to talk about this, but this probably protecting some of these DNA strands from degradation. And so they're going to get better at extracting or releasing the DNA from the environment, from the things that it's naturally attached to. And then they'll also get better, because we're always getting better at identifying how to identify mistakes and chemical modifications in the DNA that have occurred over time. And that helps us also recover what would be the original DNA code versus a modified DNA code that things get modified over time. And that gets us back to a better and better sequences for comparisons. And so when I said that they found that the DNA sequences were different than present, I didn't just mean that they're different because they're chemically modified and they're misreading the sequence. They were very carefully using a variety of different means to exclude suspect bases that potentially could be fraudulent, could be misread. And they're going with the pieces of the code that are known to be far more stable and have proven to be more stable in other studies. And so they're only comparing those portions with modern sequences in order to see whether there really is differences in those portions of the genome. And that's where they still found significant differences between the sequences of these species from the past compared to the ones that are in the present. Again, suggesting those are real changes that have occurred. An individual living 2 million years ago had a bunch of descendants, and eventually some of those descendants are ones that may have lived, are alive today, but they're also the product of a chain of additional mutations that are occurring along the way, which are basically unstoppable, right? You're going to always be making mistakes as you go. And then one other caveat about this, because young Earth creationists love to talk about genetic entropy. They like to talk about how the world is falling apart, and that includes our genomes, and that how genomes are decaying over time. And they would point to, every time you copy your DNA, you make mistakes. And a lot of those mistakes are not good. And if you can't get rid of those, if you can't select those out and so forth, our genome should be building up those mistakes. And if they're building them up, then our ability to survive is actually decaying. All right, we should be making more mistakes in the environment, becoming less adapted to the world around us. So this paper doesn't directly address that, but I can tell you from looking at this, and I'm eventually going to look at some of the sequences, because they've dumped billions of base pairs into the national database, so we'll be able to look at these sequences. And here's my challenge: look at those sequences and ask yourself, are the organisms that lived, is the mastodon that lived 2 million years ago, or the rabbit that lived 2 million years ago, or any of these plants that lived 2 million years ago, they have different sequences than the ones today because there has been an accumulation of mutations. Do the genomes look like they don't, that they are less fit? All right. In other words, is there a buildup of bad mutations that look like they're breaking genes and causing things not to function correctly? Or does it look like they have similar amounts of variation of the past than they have today, just have different variants at different sites? All right. I suspect, because I've looked at other ancient DNA, that there isn't this evidence of genomic entropy, and there should be, right? And this is something that's predictable by young Earth creationists. They're going to soon have the data in hand to test their own idea. Actually, I think they do already. They have enough ancient DNA to actually test their idea. I just think they're afraid to test it. Right? Here is an example where and there's many others like this, because there's an ancient horse, the entire genome has been sequenced, and it's found in permafrost. It's below ice age sediment. So therefore, young earth creationists should be able to look at that and say, like, that horse, all right, is more than 4,000 years old. It's a horse that's not far removed from getting off the ark. And so how different is that horse's genome from the horse's genome today? Well, it is different. It's clearly different. There are a bunch of differences between that horse and any other modern living horse. And we can see that that particular horse has many what we'd call ancestral versions of different mutations that are similar to like other species of horses. But that horse is most similar to modern horses. And yet, if you look at its whole genome, you wouldn't say that that particular horse was more fit than any horse today, right? Its genes are as functional as the genes are as functional as they are today. There's as many mutations and things that are maybe not the best version of an allele that existed then as there exists now, right? And we're going to have more and more and more organisms like this that can be clearly identified from a young earth creationist perspective as being from right after the flood. In other words, 4,000 years ago, which also means they're 2/3 as old as the whole world, which is only 6,000 years old, right? And so that should be enough time, because if I mean, after all, young earth creationists are telling us that we should be worried over the next 100 or 200 years, that species are going to be dying out and then human beings themselves are going to fall apart because of genetic entropy. If that's the case, we should be able to see that trend over 4,000 years. Taking organisms that are 4,000 years apart, we should be able to see that they have atrophied in their genome, significantly to the point where they are today. And so I'd say, there you are. Get out there and test it, right? You got some work to do. All right. I'm still talking about this. There's just a whole lot to say about this paper. It's really fascinating. So the first evidence of elephant types living in Greenland and living at the very northern tip, only 600 miles from the North Pole, nonetheless. So really amazing stuff. And then just the concept of being able to go back and look at an ecosystem from 2 million years ago and to be able to really reconstruct it at a pretty detailed way. And to add on to that, the fact that there were multiple different ecosystems that replaced each other in this same location over and over and over and over again. And each one of those ecosystems has similar sets of organisms, suggesting a period in which there's a similar climate for a long period of time. And the same organisms keep repopulating the same area as new sediments get laid down. Imagine the scene right in front of you. All right. And imagine that there's a volcano or a very large flood from the mountains nearby, and it basically wipes out this region and lays on top of it 4 or 5 feet of mud, all right, and sediments. All right. Kind of wrecks this area. Right. It's going to take another 30, 40, 50 years before you get back to this state where you see it now. Right? Another community of organisms that's going to replace it from maybe 100 miles away or 20 miles away or something like that will then begin to repopulate this area and grow this. And then you have, let's say this happens 40 or 50 times. If this happens 50 times in this area, in order for you to get several hundred feet and 50 different communities that have been buried, and each one takes 50 years, all right, that's 2,500 years. That's 2,500 years in order to create the sediment layers that you're seeing there. And then, of course, they all have to be present, and then they have to get eroded over time. Well, actually, they all get frozen, okay? And then erosion happens for a period of years. Right? Younger creationists don't have 2,500 years to spare. There's not 2,500 years worth of time to develop all these ecosystems and then have an ice age, all right, which happens 4,000 years ago. There's not enough time, all right? There's too many organisms, there's too many fossils, and not enough time. The flood can't save young Earth creationist here. The flood really can't provide an explanation, right, for the existence of these types of fossils in this particular location. And so they have to find some other mechanisms besides a chaotic flood in order to explain the layers, the organic content, the types of organisms that are present in this particular location. And they're going to have to provide a mechanism for the migration of all this to this locale, for the animals at least, to this location from a very discrete starting point, which is somewhere around Mount Ararat, all right, where Noah's Ark landed, well, the mountains of Ararat. All right, that's enough rambling from me. We'll be back sometime, and I'm sure I want to delve into this ancient DNA thing a little more. I think we're going to learn a lot about that. And, of course, young Earth creationists have been talking a lot about criticizing ancient DNA. We want to look at how papers like this can help maybe explain away some of those criticisms. All right, that's it for me. Thanks a lot. It's been fantastic. I got to get back to grading. Got to read this thesis. I haven't even opened it yet. How long is it? Well, it's 42 pages, but that includes 10 pages of references. But there's no big figures. All right, there's only a few. Oh, there's some tables in here. All right, so I should be able to get this knocked out pretty quickly. All right, so I'm going to do that. I'll keep busy tomorrow, so nothing from me tomorrow. If there is, it's because there must have been something really exciting happen tomorrow if I make a video then. All right, hey, bye. Talk to you later.